History as it happens, October 19th, 2023. Putin's forever war.
And with the world's attention glued on Israel and Gaza, Russia has been waging its biggest offensive since last winter.
Putin has announced the successful test of a new generation of nuclear-powered cruise missiles.
Mr. Putin told the South African President Cyril Ramaphosa and his colleagues that improving ties with African countries was a priority.
The war cannot go on forever.
You don't want to be trying to bake in long-term support when you're at the end of the rope. And on the Ukraine funding, we're coming near to the end of the rope.
Выразители чаяний своих культур и традиций, своих народов.
Vladimir Putin's new creed, the organizing principle of his rule, is forever war, says historian Mark Galeotti. And Putin wants the Russian people to embrace a long war not only against Ukraine, but against the West, with the fate of the motherland hanging in the balance. Forever war is something powerful countries are supposed to try to avoid. So why is Russia's autocrat pitching it as salvation? That's next as we report History as It Happens, a podcast from the Washington Times. I'm Martin DeCaro.
Clearly, Putin would like to see some kind of a victory in Ukraine, and I think he's also realistic enough to know that it's not happening any day soon. But what he's also doing is using this as a basis really for a reorganization of the whole Russian political and economic system.
When President Bush announced in October 2001 in a somber televised address that he ordered the U.S. military to begin attacking al-Qaeda training camps in Afghanistan, he asked for patience. The war would not be over quickly, and Afghanistan would only be the beginning.
In the months ahead, our patience will be one of our strengths. Patience with the long waits that will result from tighter security. Patience in understanding that it will take time to achieve our goals. Patience in all the sacrifices that may come.
But as Bush delivered those words, he probably did not expect U.S. forces to still be at war with the Taliban 20 years later. And when the U.S. invaded Iraq in early 2003, American soldiers were supposed to be greeted as liberators. Well, that war didn't go as planned either. The journalist Dexter Filkins wrote an excellent book about it titled The Forever War. In other words, a debacle. Now, I mention this just to make the point that leaders of powerful countries, whether democracies or dictatorships, are prone to massive miscalculation. See Vladimir Putin, February 2022. He envisioned Russian tanks arriving in Kyiv to be greeted as liberators within weeks. But now with his war in a stalemate, Putin is embracing the prospect of forever war, and he wants his people to welcome this opportunity too. It's a war for the future of Russian civilization the way Putin sees it, so the motherland must outlast the West. Now, of course, the idea of a long war in Ukraine is not very popular in, well, most of the rest of the world. In July, South African President Cyril Ramaphosa led a delegation of African leaders to St. Petersburg where he told Putin in person, please seek peace, because the war's impact on the world's wheat supply was hurting Africa.
Is that we do firmly believe that this war must be settled, and it must be settled through negotiations and through diplomatic means. The war cannot go on forever. All wars have to be settled and come to an end at some stage, and we are here to communicate a very clear message that we would like this war to be ended.
Putin responded that the food problems were not Russia's fault. More recently, at the Valdai Discussion Club, Putin ripped into the West again. He focused his remarks not only on Ukraine, but on Russia's real enemy, the United States. The United States and its satellites, said Putin, have taken a steady course towards hegemony in military affairs, politics, the economy, culture, and even morals and values. Since the very beginning, it's been clear to us that attempts to establish a monopoly were doomed to fail. Putin said the U.S. was arrogant to declare itself the winner of the Cold War, and he's made comments similar to these many other times in the past. Now, when you read Putin's remarks, and I do have to read a translation as I don't speak Russian, when you read what he says, he sounds paranoid. And this is not to absolve U.S. foreign policy since 1991. We've talked a lot about the post-Cold War period on the podcast. I don't need to go over it all again right now. The point is, the West got Putin wrong. It did not fully understand until it was too late that Russia's autocrat believed he was fighting an existential war while Western leaders saw a country in decline. As Obama put it about 8 years ago, Russia is a regional power, threatening some of its neighbors out of weakness. Historian Mark Galeotti is the executive director of the consultancy Mayak Intelligence and an honorary professor at the University College London. He's written many books on Russian history, most recently Putin's Wars from Chechnya to Ukraine. And Mark was on the podcast a couple of months ago. You can search for that episode. It's titled From Grozny to Bakhmut. Mark Galeotti, welcome back.
Good to be here again.
Before we get to Putin and the forever war issue, there's been a lot of talk since the outbreak of war in Israel and Gaza that, this is just talk, stuff, debris that I see online. Russia backs Hamas. Russia had something to do with this. This might benefit Russia and the Kremlin. General thoughts on that?
May this benefit Russia? It could well, particularly given the attention that is now being focused on this conflict, and also quite possibly in the longer term, the ammunition, the military supplies, and the like. There's only so much that the United States and its allies can actually hand out to one deserving cause or another. I think, though, we also have to recognize the degree to which there are also massive strategic challenges for Russia. And it's one of the reasons why, look, I don't believe we haven't seen any serious evidence that Russia was involved with this claims that Wagner mercenaries were training Hamas and such like. Look, if you think that Wagner mercenaries are not the subject of some of the most extensive intelligence gathering operations around, then you really don't know what's happening. I think from the Russians' point of view, what really struck me was actually how slow and how halting their response was. It wasn't until Monday that we had Putin's press spokesman, Peskov, issue a very, very vanilla statement about this is bad, we worry about it escalating, and everyone should talk to everyone else, essentially saying nothing at all. Putin, it took another couple of days before he said anything. And yes, he tried to say, well, this is all actually the Americans' fault because they hadn't actually pushed for some kind of resolution. But again, that, in some ways, that's just boilerplate. That's just the sort of thing, if I can mix my metaphors, that Putin says on autopilot about any crisis in the world. And I think what's really clear is, look, Russia actually had pretty good relations with Israel. And indeed, Putin had with Netanyahu. And they clearly don't want to jeopardize that. When Israeli planes go into Syria to bomb Hezbollah militias that are backing Putin's ally, Assad, the Russians switch off their air defense radars. They're perfectly happy to basically give the Israelis a pass on that. At the same time, the Russians are still trying to keep in with the Arab world. They do still have relations with Hamas. Above all, there's Iran, which is clearly Hamas's backer, and they don't want to annoy the Iranians because the Iranians are providing drones and a lot of sanctions-busting know-how. And then, as if all that wasn't complicated enough, you've also got the Saudi position. There's a growing relationship, shall we say, between Russia and Saudi Arabia, particularly Mohammed bin Salman, the crown prince, and essentially the driving force in Saudi Arabia. Clearly has a little bit of a guy crush on Putin, by all accounts. And certainly from the Russians' point of view, this is very useful because together they can very heavily influence the global oil market. Yeah. And so they're clearly trying desperately also to work out quite what Saudi Arabia wants from that. So I think from all these point of views, we have a tendency to look at the Russians' possible advantages, which are very definitely there. But I think we also don't appreciate the degree to which actually, from the Russians' point of view, things could go quite badly wrong if they make the wrong choice. And Putin, true to form, when he's faced with difficult decisions, isn't making one. Mm-hmm. So he's just relying on, old-style, empty rhetoric.
Yeah, the notion of the decisive dictator does not fit here. He dithers, at least recently. I'm not an expert on Putin's political career. Well, a couple of things. I think here in the United States, people are projecting their own obsessions onto international events. So it's about Iran, it's about Russia. And just secondly, some folks listening might say, it sounds a little tone deaf to be talking about all these geopolitical concerns when so many people are dying in Gaza and in Israel. But we have to, because world leaders like Putin are thinking about these things. So you wrote that forever war is now the organizing principle of late Putinism. You wrote a column for CNN about the ongoing war. We got to keep track of our wars here. The ongoing war in Ukraine. It's the organizing principle of late Putinism. What did you mean?
Clearly, Putin would like to see some kind of a victory in Ukraine, and I think he's also realistic enough to know that it's not happening any day soon. But what he's also doing is using this as the basis really for a reorganization of the whole Russian political and economic system. If one looks at earlier Putinism, look, there was never any question about his control over the system. But nonetheless, he was happy to allow a certain charade of politics. There were opposition parties. There were the sort of pretenses of debates. And sometimes, actually, he was willing to allow his own party, United Russia, to lose elections. He was willing to allow grassroots opposition to make some progress and such like. And also, finally, he was perfectly willing to allow a mixed economy in which the state was important, but there was also a huge role for the private sector. What we're actually seeing now is, I think, based around this notion that Russia is in some kind of long-term existential struggle, not with Ukraine specifically, but with the West. Ukraine is just the battlefield for that. It's the pretext for retrenching back to a very familiar old style of authoritarianism and greater state control over the economy, squeezing out any room for public debate and so forth. It gives an excuse for him to kind of go back into good old-fashioned autocracy.
So there are domestic purposes then that Putin's use of forever war serve, right? Because here in the West, when we say forever war, that's not a good thing. You mentioned this in your CNN piece. Iraq was a forever war. Afghanistan was a forever war. That doesn't mean that the wars don't end. It's the sense of hopelessness. We can't achieve our objectives. Putin is using it in a positive sense and also with a domestic eye.
Yeah, I mean, obviously, he is also using it in this sense against the West. I mean, from his point of view, there's no way that he can, at the moment, win any kind of a military victory on the battlefield in Ukraine. So instead, in some ways, he wins by not losing. His view is that he can outlast. He can outlast Ukraine's capacity to take the casualties that it is taking. You've got to remember that although the Russians are losing more men, proportionate to population, the Ukrainians are suffering greater losses. But also he has to outlast the West's will and ability to continue to send billions of dollars every month in military as well as financial assistance. So, his view is, look, he has to outlast it, but he also wants to demoralize us. He wants us precisely to think, look, this is not going to end ever. So why drag it out by an extra month or an extra year? Why don't we start ratcheting down our assistance for Ukraine? Why don't we start pressurizing Kyiv to reach some kind of a deal, however unfair and, frankly, unjust that would be? So I think for all these reasons, he's happy to use it as a political weapon against the West, but exactly to also use it as an attempt at a mobilizing instrument at home. If one looks at his speech at the Victory Day, the end of World War II parade, this year. Usually it's a very upbeat, bombastic tale of victories, as you'd expect. This time, though, it was very downbeat. It was about the struggles that lay ahead. It was about the way the West wanted to marginalize and even dismantle Russia, and how every Russian really was now in a position where they had to show that they were a patriot. So I think, for all of these reasons, this is in some ways something that he's trying to spin, not always successfully, but as a positive instrument to maintain his control over the Russians.
Since you mentioned World War II, Putin's brother died in the siege of Leningrad. About 1 million people starved to death, if I'm not mistaken, during the Second World War in Leningrad. His parents suffered terribly during the siege, the Nazi siege. So maybe in his view, We're 2 years into this war. World War II lasted 4 or 5 years, killed something like 25 million Soviet citizens. We have 120,000 Russian dead here. Maybe in his view, this is just how war goes. We're 2 years into this, not 4. 120,000 dead, not 25 million. So we're going to keep going on.
Yeah, look, I think that there is a sense that the West has forgotten what real war is like. I mean, let's be honest, we got into a case in which actually the wars we were going to fight were essentially wars that we chose to fight. There were going to be relatively limited incursions in other countries, and there were wars which, if need be, we could pull out of whenever we wanted. You look at Iraq, you look at particularly most recently Afghanistan. When it came down to it, Afghanistan falls to the Taliban, and that's a policy failure or whatever, but it is not an existential threat to the United States or even to Europe. Putin is absolutely hearkening back to a rather more serious notion of war. I mean, from his point of view, this is a war for Russia's future. Now, I don't think he's actually managing to convince most of the Russian people of that, but certainly this is his message. And yeah, from his point of view, look, his is an authoritarian regime. Authoritarian regimes essentially can force people to take much greater losses. And I don't just simply mean dead on the battlefield. I also mean people's quality of life shrinking and so forth. They don't have to worry. I mean, yes, he's up for re-election next year. Well, shock horror. I'm going to call it now. I'm going to say that I think Putin's going to win.
Yeah, how's he doing in the polls?
Quote me on that. Well, technically, he hasn't even said that he's standing. But on the other hand, we've already had leaks that the presidential administration want him to win with an 80% share of the vote this time around, which is the biggest more than he's ever had in the past. So in this situation, look, authoritarian regimes can basically get away with a lot more. And again, from his point of view, he regards that as one of the strengths he has.
So when he said the war is for the motherland, for our sovereignty, spiritual values, unity, and victory. You quoted him in your article. I was going to ask you, what does he mean by that? But maybe the better question is, does he actually believe this? Because, just hear me out here. When I hear President Biden say the war in Ukraine is important to Americans because it's a front line in a global struggle of democracy versus autocracy, I hear someone who's trying to convince Americans that they haven't really been thinking about very much. I mean, Ukraine, 2 years ago, 3 years ago, most Americans probably wouldn't have said Ukraine is all that important. Likewise, Woodrow Wilson. It was a novel idea in the 19-teens for Americans to have to care about a European war. But, he elevated the importance of that in his April 1917 speech. The world must be made safe for democracy, a message to a skeptical American public that, we do actually have an interest in the outcome of this war. So, back to Putin, his apocalyptic rhetoric designed to rally Russians around the idea that, need to win this war or our civilization might fail. It's a forever war, and I mean that as a good thing. Does he believe this, or is this just messaging?
I think he does believe it. I mean, look, I'm sure there's elements of exaggeration for political purposes. Putin is enough of a politician to want to bring his audience along with him. But in essence, it is. The interesting thing is this. Look, the war in Ukraine is often precisely framed as an attempt to stop creeping authoritarianism, as if Ukraine falls, then where's going to be next? I think that's to misunderstand the situation. And look, I really don't understand as if I'm in any way acting as Putin's defender here, but I think we have to understand from his point of view, he is the defender. He believes that in a way the West has for years now been coming for him. The West is trying to impose its views and its values on Russia. And so he's pushing back against that. So yes, on the one hand, he absolutely thinks this is about Russia's values and sovereignty and such like, rather than it being forced to become just some kind of puppet of the West. But that doesn't mean to say that this is some kind of grand ideology. We're not back in Soviet times when the Soviet Union did, however cynically, but still cleave to a view that ultimately its goal was to spread Marxism, Leninism across the planet. Putin's not sitting there. He's not trying to think that, the French should become Russian Orthodox or that the Dutch should adopt his political system. His view is basically sovereignty is about being able to say no and push back.
Yeah, so he just gave a speech a few days ago, the Valdai Discussion Club that was held in Sochi. that sounded a lot like the Munich Security Conference speech from 2007, where he warns the West, who are you anyway? What right do you have to warn the rest of the world that, your civilization is superior to ours? So to your point, he does see this as a civilizational war. Is that the right way of putting it?
Yeah, I think so.
So a book I've been relying on a lot lately for preparation is Ian Kershaw's book, The Global Age, which is about the second half of the 20th century in Europe, all the way up to 2017, actually. He writes here, there was no systematic ideological doctrine underpinning Putinism. A strong state and a forceful foreign policy aimed at restoring Russia's status as a great power sufficed. So I was going to ask you next, what are the origins of this idea of being at war with the West? Is this something new? Is it something recent? I actually think you can find evidence of it right from the beginning of Putin's rule, and he probably even thought this way earlier when he was in the KGB and then the FSB. He was the head of the FSB for a short time. Kershaw writes here, from 1999 onwards, there was a consistent emphasis on Russian national values and invocation of the country's status as a great power. Putin started to put an end to the widespread feeling of humiliation at the drastic diminution in the standing of the country after the collapse of the USSR, to give people back their proud Russian identity and to make them believe in the country's future and a return to former glory. So would you say that still applies today? And do you agree that the origins of this idea of being at war with the West really goes back decades with him?
Yeah, look, I think that we do know that even before he was president, he was making speeches where particularly he hammered home this idea that Russia is a great power. And it's not a great power because it has nuclear weapons or because of the size of its army or anything else. It's just a great power because that is Russia's birthright. The sense that precisely it was Russians who bled to defeat Hitler. It was Russians who bled to defeat Napoleon. Time and again, Russians have saved civilization, and that makes us a great power. And from his point of view, whenever we in the West don't, as it were, accept his definition of what that means, we are being unfair to Russia. And there's a very strong chip on his shoulder, a sense of inferiority. Remember, Putin, I think, is very much part of the last gasp generation of the Homo Sovieticus, the Soviet man who was raised in an environment in which he was part of a superpower. And then he saw that whole empire collapse in 1989 to 1991. And I think it's metastasized from that sense of what have we lost to who took it from us. And the 1990s, this period of kind of chaos and anarchy in Russia, sense where precisely Russia was being taken for granted, being ignored, being plundered by all these foreign businesses coming in and taking our oil and our gas and everything else. And from Putin's point of view, this needed to be addressed, that Russia had to be brought back from the brink. Now, at first, there were a few years where I think he genuinely thought that he could reach some kind of a deal with the West. And particularly when we had 9/11, Putin was one of I think he was the first foreign leader to actually offer his direct, not just condolences, but offers of help. When the United States and allied forces went into Afghanistan, he was perfectly happy for them to be supplied along Russian railways, by Russian ports and airports and such like. But he thought that he had a deal which more or less said, look, you fight your wars, you do what you feel you have to do, but of course you'll extend that same privilege to me. And he went into this rebellious region of Chechnya, very, very violent and vicious counterinsurgency campaign. And as soon as the West started saying, well, hang on, what about human rights? He clearly at that point started to think, what the hell are you doing, you hypocrites? I've let you have your war, let me have mine. But still, it was a process of disenchantment. I think he dramatically misunderstood the West. Remember, this is a guy who, although he had been in the KGB in East Germany, he'd never traveled in the West as a tourist or a student or anything like that. He had no real understanding of the West. And so, he felt that the West was basically actually trying to marginalize Russia. And where that really crystallized, 2011, 2012, Putin's just coming back to the presidency. In order to observe term limits, he has sort of technically stepped back from being president and just become prime minister with a sort of sock puppet president, Dmitry Medvedev, in his place. But anyway, he's coming back. There are protests in Moscow, the largest protests we've seen in post-Soviet times in Russia, so-called Bolotnaya protests, precisely because there's an educated, liberal middle class is angry. It's angry that there's just been an election where there was clear voter fraud, but also angry because that idea that more or less the presidency is something that can just be swapped between guys, by backroom deals. Now, this was a real, genuine, organic protest. But as far as Putin was concerned, no, clearly this was actually made in Langley. It was a CIA operation to unseat him. And I think from this point, he thought, right, this is the sign they're now coming for me. And in hindsight, I think we can see that from about 2012, Putin and his regime and his intelligence services begin to move into, shall I say, war footing. That actually, as far as they're concerned, there's been nothing declared. It's not going to be a kinetic war with tanks and missiles. It's all going to be covert disinformation and subversion and everything else. But as far as he's concerned, he was at war really since then.
Wow, so many interesting points in that answer. Yes, in 2011, Secretary of State Hillary Clinton criticized Russia for the way it dealt with those protests. That infuriated Putin. Also, Muammar Gaddafi's demise. Apparently, Putin watched the video of that over and over and over again, furious about the Western intervention there. Even though he did, and I agree with you, he did try to reach some type of modus vivendi with the West during these years. It was always going to be on Russia's terms, right? And also, Calder Walton, his new book about spycraft, title is Spies, opened my eyes to something, and I tend to agree with this view, that he was always playing a double game anyway. The old KGB agent or KGB officer has never really died inside of him, and he's always been really at war with the West from an intelligence point of view. Disinformation, meddling in elections, sowing discord in other countries. That really wasn't a question there, Mark. But what are your just general thoughts on that this double game he's always been playing?
I'm a bit skeptical about this idea that, to understand Putin, all you need to know is that he was ex-KGB. It's worth noting, if nothing else, he was a really mediocre KGB officer. We have actually seen some of his performance reports, and it was kind of always, to summarize it, he wasn't bad. He wasn't great. He was never going to be one of the stars. He was never going to be a James Bond, which is clearly what he had in his own mind for his career. And most of the time, particularly when he was in East Germany, he was really a glorified file clerk.
Yeah, he wasn't doing much when the wall came down.
No, exactly. I mean, basically, he was moving papers back and forth, having liaison meetings and getting progressively podgier on German beer, even by his own account. But so I think it's not so much that it's the KGB man now as president. It's how did he get into the KGB in the first place, given that he didn't come from a particularly prestigious family or anything like that? I mean, I think this was actually, it was always Putin's manner. I mean, this is a man who a whole variety of people comment on the fact that he always was incredibly emotionally closed. He did not give out what he was actually thinking, that he clearly was able to play different roles in front of different people. And I think it's, yes, the KGB then maybe sort of refined some of that. But I think actually what we're seeing is more Putin was an obvious choice to become a KGB officer rather than somehow being a KGB shaped him. So, I mean, on one level, one could say, well, it's an entirely pedantic and pointless interjection because the result is the same. But I think why it's worth stressing that is that the KGB, for all its flaws, I mean, it was obviously a ghastly agency of repression, but nonetheless, it did believe in something. It was the sword and shield of the Communist Party. That was its logo and its motto. And even while they were basically corruptly feathering their own nests, most of the officers there did actually believe in something. And the interesting thing is the degree to which Putin clearly didn't. He was never interested in communist ideology. He joined the Young Pioneers, the sort of Cub Scout movement for the communists, because basically you had to at school. But, he was never seen as politically particularly active. And I think from Putin's point of view, it was always about self-interest. It was always about what's going to be for me. And again, this is it. Putin does not believe in anything grand. Yes, he's a Russian nationalist and so forth. But when it comes down to it, Putin believes in Putin and whatever works best for him and his mates.
And those old KGB, now FSB hands believe in something else. Money. We have to consider the marriage of the security services post-1991 with organized crime. This is the so-called mafia state, the complete criminalization of the Russian economy. You know, Putin has always considered the collapse of the USSR as a catastrophe for his country, and he's got a point. When you've been a superpower and then you're dealt the blow that Russia was dealt in the 1990s. We haven't even mentioned NATO enlargement, which was another humiliation for not just Putin and Yeltsin and Gorbachev, but the Russian establishment, the Russian foreign ministry. They all opposed it. How ironic, then, that he, Putin, and his country are falling into the same trap as the USSR, spending an even larger percentage of GDP on defense, as you make this point in your piece for CNN, at the expense of other priorities. What can you say about that problem as this war in Ukraine goes on? A forever war, as he puts it, in a positive way.
Yeah, I mean, look, I see the way that Russia is evolving. We always play the historical parallels game, even though there's a limit to how far one can rely on history as a predictive tool. But increasingly, I think what we're actually seeing is in some ways a reinvention of late Brezhnevism. In other words, late 1970s Soviet Union. Because if one looks at the Brezhnev era, first few years were actually very successful. The Soviet Union was on the rise. People could actually think, oh my God, you know, that it's not just in terms of nuclear weapons and such like, but also in terms of economic power. Where are they going to end up? It turned out to be pretty illusory. And this system began just to grind down under the weight of not just the defense budget, but also, you know, massive levels of industrial scale corruption and embezzlement, and a huge level of just public disenchantment. You couldn't protest. The KGB was always there, and it was frankly one of the last efficient elements of the Soviet system. So how else do you basically fight back? The answer is you get miserable. I mean, the suicide rates sort of went through the roof. Alcoholism became, you know, a serious killer. You steal on a petty level. I remember once a Russian who obviously spent much of his life in Soviet times saying, look, you know, only a moron buys a light bulb. Because when one of the light bulbs in your house or your apartment goes, you just basically unscrew it, take it into the office or the factory or wherever, and replace it with one there. You know, the glories of everything being standardized. So, you know, in these circumstances, you have dissolution, you have corruption, and you have a parasitic defense industrial complex that is just eating what money you've got. Well, that I can't help thinking is what we're getting in late Putinism. There's no more ideas. There's no more chance, I think, at reform or real modernization. Instead, exactly, we've now got perhaps up to 10% of GDP, you know, a ruinously high level going on to defense spending, and no real end of that in sight. We see the fact that at the same time, not just Putin's cronies, but the whole sort of system is basically built around rent seeking and embezzlement. 40% of the military procurement budget is, according to the main military prosecutor's office, stolen. And this helps explain why when they went into Ukraine, you know, their notionally high-tech scrambled radios, when they cracked open the outer shell, there's just a cheap Chinese walkie-talkie inside. You know, all that kind of thing. It helps explain some of their failures. And finally, ordinary Russians, as I say, they're not being won over by Putin's rhetoric. They're not thinking this is a grand struggle. They're just getting depressed and miserable. And that means lower productivity and so forth.
40%. That is astonishing. And speaking of Brezhnev, I mean, we're seeing a kind of Brezhnev doctrine here. During the Soviet period, the Brezhnev doctrine, if a vassal state wants to go its own way, well, then you send in the tanks. He's treating Ukraine that way. You know, all this raises a question, other than its natural resources, oil and gas, and, you know, fine art and literature. What does Russia have to offer the rest of the world? We know during the Soviet period they couldn't even make an electric toaster anyone wanted, couldn't make vehicles, consumer products. He's putting so much of his legacy and the nation's future on an unwinnable war rather than developing, well, stuff that maybe the rest of the world would want from such a large and important country.
Yeah, I mean, this is part of Russia's tragedy. Look, the first 2 terms of Putin's presidency, he had no real challenges domestically or internationally. because of the state of the global economy, business was booming in Russia. There was a huge amount of money sloshing around, perfectly enough for him and his mates to enrich themselves and buy whatever yacht they wanted. And yet there was still, in that moment, a key point where they could have spent a lot of that on diversifying the economy, moving away from this dependence on oil and gas, moving away from essentially Soviet legacy factories. There's a huge human capital in Russia. I mean, if one looks at, for example, within things like computer technology, it is very clear that there are a lot of smart people there. They become massively underused, and not least, therefore, a lot of the smart people get the hell out and go to other countries. So Putin wasted that crucial moment. So in the future, I mean, look, oil and gas will continue to be used for quite some time, even as we move towards net zero and so forth. There'll be large parts of the world and economies that still require that. What else has Russia got? Well, I mean, unfortunately, when this war ends, Russia will have a large and expanded defense industrial complex. All the factories that they're reopening and moving on to 24/7 multiple shift cycles and everything else. They're not churning out the best, the highest technology equipment, but again, as back in Soviet times, what they're producing is cheap, mass, okay kit. You're not going to see a NATO country want to buy it, but there's huge swaths of the world for which actually they can't afford the latest, there was this word, exquisite technology. Exquisite seems to just simply mean eye-wateringly expensive, that Western defense systems are sort of based on these days. So, I mean, unfortunately, again, in a callback to Soviet times, what will Russia offer the world? It will offer, beyond just simply the capacities of causing mischief, oil, gas, and cheap guns.
So my last question to you is something I've never heard an answer on from anyone. Maybe I haven't asked the question yet. Putin considers himself a student of history, as we know. What does he think of the Soviet quagmire in Afghanistan? I mean, apparently he hasn't learned that lesson as he wages war in Ukraine. Just to briefly bring people up to speed, the Soviets invaded Afghanistan in 1979 because Hafizullah Amin's regime, and he was a communist, was losing control of the country. Amin came to power after the KGB had been in the country messing around there. But long story short, 1979, the Soviet Union invades, ostensibly to save a communist regime in Kabul. This was to enforce the Brezhnev doctrine that we mentioned. But Putin is following in the same footsteps.
Well, look, Putin likes to think of himself as being a student of history. He's a really, really bad historian. Yes. He commits the cardinal sins of cherry-picking the bits he wants to see and ignoring all the rest in between. Afghanistan, it's not just simply that it was a war that the Soviets fought 10 years and still weren't able to win, and actually just simply threw up their hands and pulled out. It was a war that was built around essentially stupid decisions being made by old men who did not question slanted and inaccurate briefings they were being given. So again, there's a very, very, very clear sort of resonance there. And the interesting thing is that Afghanistan is increasingly these days in Russian discourse, particularly kind of on social media and the like, being raised precisely as an example of the kind of ridiculous things that actually an out-of-touch leadership can make. And clearly they're using it as a metaphor for Ukraine, even though 10 years of war in Afghanistan, the Soviets lost 15,000 men compared to the Russians having lost 120,000 in just over, a year and a half.
And you said Ukraine. 15,000 in...
15, yes. Exactly. But in terms of what Putin thinks, the interesting thing is that he talks about it very, very rarely. When he does, he very much gives a kind of essentially a Soviet line, which is that this was, let's call it red man's burden, that this was not something the Soviet Union wanted to have to do. But it had to go in because otherwise there would be chaos, or the Americans would move in, or you'd have jihadists taking control, or whatever else. Again, it's that sense of what could the Soviet Union do but go in? And again, he's not really talking about Afghanistan. He himself is also using Afghanistan as a metaphor for Ukraine. He's trying to kind of convey this sense of, this was not my decision. This was something that was forced on me by events. So you can't blame me, in other words.
Historian Mark Galeotti, we are indebted for your insights. And if you'd like to hear more of Mark's knowledge, he has a podcast. It is called In Moscow's Shadows. On the next episode of History as It Happens, we will return to the Middle East and the ongoing war in Gaza. We'll return to the year 1948 to search for the origins of today's conflict and the events of that year. And that is next as we report History as It Happens, a podcast from the Washington Times.